They weren't on the front lines. They didn't charge beaches or hold trenches. They flew in formation at 25,000 feet, in unpressurized metal tubes, towards some of the most heavily defended targets on Earth. And, statistically, more of them died than almost any other group in the entire war. This is the story of why. Before getting into the specific conditions that made bomber crew service so lethal, it helps to understand what the numbers actually looked like, because for most people, they are genuinely difficult to process. The United States Army Air Forces flew strategic bombing campaigns over Europe and the Pacific throughout the war. In the European theater, the primary instrument of that campaign was the 8th Air Force, based in England. Between 1942 and 1945, the 8th Air Force suffered approximately 26,000 men killed in action and another 28,000 taken prisoner. It lost more than 10,000 aircraft in combat and sustained more casualties than the entire United States Marine Corps during the same period. The British Royal Air Force's Bomber Command presents a similar picture, arguably starker. Of the approximately 125,000 men who served in Bomber Command aircrew roles, roughly 55,000 were killed, a death rate of around 44%. When prisoners of war, the wounded, and those who survived crashes within Allied territory are added, the total casualty figure approaches 75% of all who served. For every 4 men who put on a Bomber Command flight suit, 3 did not come home intact. These numbers existed alongside a specific detail that made them even more striking. Bomber crew members were volunteers. They applied, were selected, and trained for months before their first mission. They knew in general terms what the odds looked like, and they flew anyway. The tour of duty system was meant to give men something to aim for. American crews in the 8th Air Force were initially required to complete 25 missions before rotation out of combat. RAF Bomber Command set a tour at 30 operations. In practice, during the worst periods of the air war, the statistical probability of surviving a full tour was roughly 1 in 4. During some specific periods and against specific targets, the odds were considerably worse. What made those odds so severe, what made bomber service uniquely lethal in ways ground combat or naval service was not, is where the story begins. The bombers themselves were remarkable machines for their time and also environments that presented lethal dangers entirely apart from enemy action. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator were the 2 primary American heavy bombers used in Europe. Both were large, 4-engine aircraft capable of carrying substantial bomb loads over long distances. Both required crews of 10 men: pilots, navigators, bombardiers, radio operators, and gunners stationed at multiple positions around the aircraft. Both were cold, deafening, and brutally unforgiving of mechanical failure. At operational altitude, typically between 20,000 and 30,000 feet, the temperature inside could drop to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. The aircraft were not meaningfully heated. Crew members wore electrically heated flight suits, but the systems were unreliable and uneven. Frostbite was not a rare misfortune. It was a routine operational hazard. Men lost fingers, toes, and portions of their faces to cold on missions where nothing else went wrong. The oxygen systems presented a related threat. Above 10,000 feet, crew members needed supplemental oxygen continuously. The masks were connected by hoses and valves vulnerable to freezing, disconnection, and damage. A crew member who lost oxygen at altitude had minutes before losing consciousness. And in the noise and chaos of a combat mission, a man going quietly unconscious at his gun position might not be noticed in time. The B-17 and B-24 also presented specific dangers when needing to be abandoned. Getting from a rear gun position to an exit point was not simple, particularly if the aircraft was on fire, spinning, or losing altitude fast. The centrifugal forces generated by a stricken bomber in a spin could pin crew members to the interior walls, making movement impossible. Parachutes were stored separately from the harnesses worn during flight. In an emergency, a crew member had to locate his pack, clip it to his harness, reach an exit, and jump, all while the aircraft might be in flames or structural collapse. The bailout procedure in a damaged aircraft was a chaotic physical process that many men failed to complete in the time available. Post-mission analysis showed that many crews went down with their planes simply because the combination of damage altitude loss, and fire left too little time to get out. And that was before the German defenses, specifically designed to make survival as unlikely as possible. To understand what bomber crews actually faced in practical terms, no single event is more instructive than what happened on October 14, 1943, a date that became known to the men of the 8th Air Force as Black Thursday. The target was Schweinfurt, a city in central Germany, housing factories that produced a significant portion of Germany's ball bearing output. Ball bearings were essential components in virtually every piece of German military machinery. American planners believed destroying the Schweinfurt factories would deliver a crippling blow to German war production. The mission had been attempted once before, on August 17, 1943, with heavy losses. October 14th was the second attempt. On the morning of October 14th, 291 B-17 took off from bases in England. Their route would take them deep into Germany, beyond the range of the fighter escorts that provided protection for the early and late portions of the mission. For the long middle section, the approach to Schweinfurt, the bomb run, and the initial withdrawal, the bombers would be entirely alone. What happened over those hours became one of the defining episodes of the air war in Europe. The German air defenses were waiting. Fighter units that had tracked the formations approach concentrated their aircraft and launched coordinated attacks against the bomber stream. German fighter pilots had developed specific tactics for attacking bomber formations, attacking from the front, where the bomber's defensive armament was weakest, or targeting the lead aircraft in each formation to disrupt the bombing accuracy of the planes behind. Simultaneously, German anti-aircraft batteries, known by their German abbreviation, Flak, fired from the ground below, filling the air at altitude with exploding shells designed to fragment and send shards of metal through aircraft, engines, fuel tanks, and crew members. The battle that unfolded lasted hours. B-17S fell throughout. Some exploded outright when fuel tanks or bomb loads were hit. Others caught fire and went into spiraling dives, trailing smoke. Others absorbed damage and continued, their crews fighting to keep them in formation while dealing with wounded men, failed engines, and compromised flight controls. By the time the surviving aircraft landed back in England, the toll was clear. 60 B-17 had been lost, meaning 600 men missing, killed, or captured in a single afternoon. Another 17 aircraft were so badly damaged they were written off. Of the 291 aircraft that had taken off, only 33 returned completely undamaged. The casualty rate among the participating crews was approximately 26% in a single mission. The 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration missions into Germany after Black Thursday. The loss rate was simply unsustainable. The missions resumed only after the introduction of long-range fighter escorts, specifically the North American P-51 Mustang, that could accompany the bombers all the way to the target and back. But Black Thursday had made clear what the crews already knew. The path from takeoff to target and back was not measured in miles. It was measured in a sequence of specific survivable or unsurvivable moments. Of the two primary threats facing bomber crews, fighters and anti-aircraft fire, the fighters were more visually dramatic. Men saw them coming. They could track them, call warnings, and respond. Flak was different, and in some ways, worse. Anti-aircraft fire came from batteries of large guns positioned around targets and along known approach routes, integrated with radar networks that allowed ground commanders to track formations, calculate altitude and speed, and direct fire accordingly. A single exploding shell sent thousands of fragments in all directions at high velocity. A formation flying in tight groupings to maximize mutual defensive fire also concentrated the effect. A shell detonating in the middle of a formation could damage multiple aircraft simultaneously. From inside a bomber flying through a flak barrage, the experience was described by survivors in consistent terms. The air was filled with black puffs of smoke, close enough to hear as concussive thuds against the airframe, close enough to smell the cordite, close enough to send shrapnel through the skin of the aircraft, through fuel lines, through crew stations, and through crew members. Unlike a fighter attack, there was nothing a crew could do. The bombers flew straight and level on the bomb run, required for accurate bombing. During the period of greatest exposure, they could not bank, dive, or accelerate. They flew straight into whatever was being thrown at them and waited for the bombs to release. The wounds produced by flak fragments were often severe and unusual. A fragment entering through the thin aluminum skin could travel through the interior and strike a crew member from an unexpected angle. Gunners in exposed turret positions were particularly vulnerable. Flight surgeons documented wounds consistent with high-velocity metal fragments, deep, penetrating, and often carrying pieces of the aircraft's structure into the wound. Many crew members flew missions with fragments embedded from previous flights. Wounds treated but not fully resolved, because the alternative was removal from flight status. The culture within bomber groups placed enormous informal pressure on men to keep flying. To be the man who stayed behind while his crew flew was a psychological burden most found heavier than the physical risk of continuing. The flak threat never diminished as the war progressed. German anti-aircraft defenses became more sophisticated, not less. And the deeper the bombers penetrated into Germany, the denser the defensive networks became. What flak could not do was finish the job alone. The combination of fighter attack and anti-aircraft fire is what made certain targets, and certain days, so catastrophic. And the men who survived those days carried something that didn't show up in any medical report. The interior of a heavy bomber in combat was an environment that most people who have not studied it would struggle to visualize accurately. It was not a compartment with seats and windows. It was a narrow, cluttered tube of aluminum and equipment, divided into stations connected by passages barely wide enough for a man in full flight gear to squeeze through. The noise level at operational altitude and power settings made voice communication impossible without the interphone system, a shared circuit that allowed crew members to talk to each other through their oxygen masks. The interphone was essential, and also a channel through which the sounds of combat, warnings, calls for help, the terse exchanges of men managing crises, passed to every crew member simultaneously. When a crew member was wounded, whoever was nearest dealt with it. There was no dedicated medical position on a heavy bomber. The radio operator typically carried first aid supplies and was expected to provide basic care under fire. Treating a wound at altitude meant working with gloved hands in a space too small to move freely, on a man who might be in shock, while the aircraft continued through whatever had caused the wound in the first place. The psychological environment this created was distinctive. 10 men in a confined space, dependent on each other absolutely, sharing every sound and communication, going through the same experience at the same moment, but from physically different positions that created very different levels of exposure and danger. The gunners in the ball turret, a spherical position suspended beneath the aircraft's fuselage, and the tail gunner were the most isolated and among the most exposed. A malfunction in the ball turret's rotation mechanism could leave its occupant unable to exit, a situation that became catastrophic if the aircraft needed to make a belly landing or if the landing gear failed. The crew dynamics that developed within bomber crews became a central feature of the experience. Men who flew together for multiple missions developed an interdependence that went beyond professional function. The loss of a crew member, to wounds, to being shot down while flying with a different crew, to finishing a tour ahead of the others, disrupted something hard to articulate and harder to replace. Flying with a new man in a position previously held by someone trusted was a specific named anxiety among bomber crews. Replacement crews, new men arriving to fill spaces left by casualties, were a constant presence in the bomber groups. They arrived with training complete, but without the accumulated knowledge that came from actual missions. Statistically, the early missions of a crew's tour were the most dangerous, and the crews who had survived long enough to accumulate experience knew it. A replacement on his first mission was a different kind of risk than a veteran on his 15th, and everyone in the formation understood this without needing to discuss it. The experience of watching other aircraft go down happened on nearly every combat mission against defended targets. Sometimes a B-17 simply vanished in a flash before the mind could register it. Other times, a stricken aircraft would fly alongside the formation for seconds or minutes, trailing fire or smoke before its final descent. In those moments, crews in nearby aircraft could sometimes see figures at windows or exit points, and the question of whether those men were getting out was visible in real time. Survival in those moments depended on factors no training could entirely prepare a man for, and the physical conditions they faced if they did get out were formidable in their own right. Bailing out of a stricken bomber over enemy territory was not the end of the danger. In many ways, it was the beginning of a new set of them. The act of parachuting from a high-altitude aircraft presented immediate physical hazards. At 25,000 feet without oxygen, a man lost consciousness in minutes. If forced to bail out at high altitude, the recommended procedure was to delay opening the parachute, to fall to a lower altitude where oxygen was available, before pulling the ripcord. This required a degree of composure that was difficult to maintain while in free fall, possibly wounded, possibly disoriented, possibly having just watched the aircraft around them explode. Men who successfully opened their parachutes at altitude faced a long descent through air that was extremely cold and through which they could observe from above where they were going to land. Over Germany or German-occupied territory, a parachuting airman was visible for a long distance. German ground personnel, civilians, and military units could and did track descending airmen and position themselves to intercept them at the landing point. What happened at the landing point varied. Some airmen were met by German military personnel and taken into custody in an orderly fashion, processed as prisoners of war, and eventually placed in the camp system. Others encountered civilians first, and the nature of those encounters depended heavily on where they landed, what had recently happened in that area, and the disposition of whoever was present. In areas that had been subjected to Allied bombing, which by 1944 included much of the German interior, the reception of descending Allied airmen by civilian populations was not reliably safe. German propaganda had spent years characterizing Allied bomber crews as deliberate murderers of civilians, and in communities that had recently lost people and property to bombing raids, that framing had taken hold. Encounters with downed airmen were unpredictable and sometimes violent. The German military issued guidance on handling downed Allied airmen, guidance that was followed inconsistently. In some areas, officials intervened to protect captured airmen and ensure their transfer to military custody. In others, they did not. For those who avoided immediate capture, evading across occupied Europe to reach Allied lines was real but extraordinarily difficult. Escape networks, organized by local resistance movements and supported by Allied intelligence, existed in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and they successfully returned hundreds of airmen over the course of the war. But reaching those networks required luck, the ability to communicate without language, and help from civilians risking their own lives. Men who were captured and placed in the German prisoner of war system faced conditions that deteriorated sharply as the war progressed. Capture was not a safe outcome. It was simply a different kind of danger. The American bombing campaign over Europe was conducted primarily in daylight, on the theory that precision formation bombing in clear conditions could hit specific industrial targets and was therefore more effective than blind bombing at night. The British had tried daylight bombing early in the war and had abandoned it after suffering unsustainable losses before American entry into the conflict. RAF Bomber Command switched to night operations as its primary doctrine and maintained that approach through the end of the war. Night bombing had its own logic and its own particular dangers, which were different from, and in some ways more psychologically demanding than, those of daylight operations. Flying at night over defended territory removed the visual clarity of daylight formation, flying. Aircraft were separated to reduce the risk of collision in the dark, which also meant they operated without the mutual defensive fire that provided some protection in American formations. A bomber command Lancaster or Halifax approaching a target was largely on its own, navigating by instruments and by the guidance of increasingly sophisticated electronic navigation systems that the RAF developed over the course of the war. The German defenses adapted to night operations with their own countermeasures. German night fighters, equipped with radar and directed by ground controllers, became increasingly effective as the war progressed. German pilots developed techniques for approaching British bombers from below, where the bomber crews had limited visibility and defensive coverage was weakest. A Lancaster, which carried a crew of 7, had no gun position covering the space directly beneath the aircraft. German night fighters exploited this gap systematically. The psychological experience of night operations was described by Bomber Command veterans in terms that emphasized the particular quality of the darkness, the isolation, and the specific horror of seeing a nearby aircraft, visible only as a shape against the sky or as a sudden fire, go down without warning or sound audible over the engines. The men of Bomber Command flew through a series of campaigns: the Battle of the Ruhr, the Battle of Hamburg, the Battle of Berlin, in which loss rates reached levels that commanders acknowledged at the time were catastrophic. The Berlin campaign of 1943 and 1944 was particularly severe, with loss rates per mission that significantly exceeded the point at which a crew could statistically expect to survive a full tour. The losses were not hidden from the crews themselves. They lived in the same bases as the men who did not come back, slept in the same barracks, ate in the same mess halls. Empty beds, empty chairs, names not called at morning briefing. These were the daily texture of life for men who continued to fly. The ground crews watching from below carried their own version of this weight, and their experience of the bomber war is a chapter that rarely receives the attention it deserves. A dimension of the bomber war that receives less attention than the air crew experience is the position of the ground crews, the mechanics, armorers, fuelers, and support personnel who prepared the aircraft and then stood on the airfields as they took off, waited through the hours of the mission, and counted the aircraft as they returned. Ground crew members were not in the air. They were not directly exposed to flak or fighters, but their relationship to the losses was intimate and sustained in a way that had its own psychological weight. Each aircraft on a bomber base was assigned a ground crew responsible for its maintenance and preparation. These men knew their aircraft mechanically in the way a surgeon knows an operating room. Every system, every recurring fault, every idiosyncrasy. They also knew the air crews who flew them, not abstractly, but personally, by name and by habit. When an aircraft did not return, the ground crew whose plane it was faced the specific experience of having their aircraft and the men in it simply absent, not diverted, not damaged, gone. The uncertainty lasted until information arrived through official channels, which could take days. In the interim, the ground crew prepared their empty hardstand for a replacement aircraft and a replacement crew. The emotional weight of this repeated experience, caring for aircraft and crews, losing them, preparing for new ones, losing those, accumulated over months and years without the release that combat itself might provide. Ground crews had no mission to fly, no task that engaged them during the hours when their aircraft were over Germany. They waited. Several accounts from Bomber Command ground personnel describe the practice of listening for engines as aircraft returned, trying to count and identify specific sounds before they came into visual range, and what it felt like when the count fell short of what had left that morning. The men in the aircraft had each other and the demands of the mission. The men on the ground had the weight and the math of what came back and what didn't. The tour of duty system, the idea that completing a fixed number of missions entitled a crew member to rotation out of combat, was one of the central structures of the bomber war, and it created its own set of psychological realities that shaped the experience of everyone who flew. For American crews in the 8th Air Force, the initial requirement was 25 missions. The number was chosen with reference to expected loss rates. At the rates that prevailed early in the campaign, 25 missions represented a substantial but potentially survivable commitment. The hope was that a finite number would give men something to count toward and sustain the will to continue. In practice, the number was simultaneously too high and not high enough. Too high because during the worst periods of 1943, the probability of surviving 25 missions was so low that many men understood it was essentially theoretical. Not high enough because the Air Force periodically raised the required number as loss rates shifted. American crews who reached 25 missions in 1944 sometimes found the requirement extended to 30 or 35. That change produced documented specific anger among the men affected. The superstitions that developed around mission counts, the relationships between men at different points in their tours, the obsessive arithmetic of missions completed and remaining, these were universal across the bomber groups. Men who were close to finishing flew with a particular awareness of what proximity to survival meant, and a specific dread of dying on mission 23 when the finish line was 25. The RAF tour system operated differently. Bomber Command set a first tour at 30 operations, with a mandatory rest period as an instructor before a second tour of 20. The rest period was designed to preserve experienced aircrew. In practice, experienced men were often under significant pressure, formal and informal, to return before their rest was complete. The contradictions of the tour system reflected a broader tension running through the entire bomber campaign. The men being sent on these missions were a finite resource. The campaign requirements were not. The men who completed their tours and came home were not unaffected by what they had been through. The psychological consequences of sustained bomber operations, flying repeatedly into environments where death was a statistical near certainty, watching crew members and fellow crews die, carrying the weight of the tour system's arithmetic, did not dissipate when the missions ended. In the immediate post-war period, the vocabulary and institutional framework for understanding what these men carried did not exist. What would now be recognized as the lasting effects of sustained extreme stress was understood, when it was understood at all, as something men were expected to manage privately. There were no structured programs for the transition from combat flying to civilian life. Men were demobilized, given discharge papers, and sent home. What followed for many was a period of difficulty that families noticed but couldn't name. Sleep disturbance, hypervigilance, difficulty in crowds, the intrusion of sounds or smells that returned the mind to altitude. These were common. The men who had flown 30 or 35 missions and come home were carrying an accumulation of experience that had no civilian equivalent and no ready audience. Some spoke about it extensively. Others never did. Not to their families, not to anyone. The culture of the era offered them little in the way of alternative. Their stories, the specific texture of what it had been like to be 22 years old in the nose of a B-17 over Schweinfurt or in the tail of a Lancaster over Berlin, began to be documented systematically only decades later when historians understood that the window for capturing them was closing. The 8th Air Force Memorial in London lists the names of more than 26,000 American airmen killed in the European campaign. RAF Bomber Command's memorial, unveiled in Green Park in London in 2012, carries the names of 55,573 Bomber Command aircrew killed during the war. Both memorials represent a specific accounting. The names of those who did not make it back from missions that the men who did survive spent the rest of their lives carrying with them. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.